beautiful mind. Remember that Russell Crowe movie? That beautiful mind is what we have. When they say, quasi, remember quasi-luminous? When he's ranting and raving and spewing and spitting and doing all these quasi-type things. What does he say people are doing here? He says we're mining for gold. More like pining for gold. Whining for gold. If you take mining for gold in the literal sense, and actually Jamie and I were discussing this yesterday, how parables and allegories and stories, they have different layers. They have a physical layer, a literal layer, and they have a spiritual layer. The deeper, the esoteric layer, meaning. And they have more than one layers. You could say there's a physical, literal layer, there's a spiritual layer, and there's an emotional layer, the one that creates the tugs and the ties that bind you to it. The reason I wrote gold as G-O-A-L-E-D is because that's a projection from the gold, from the G-O-L-D. That's the next logical step. If you take mining for gold in the literal sense, the physical sense, what do you have? You have physical layers in earth. You grab not a pitchfork, you grab a shovel or your modern day boring machine, and you start hacking through all these physical sediment layers. You dig a hole. That's what it is, right? You're digging a hole. So you're mining. Gold is our typical example. Gold isn't as valuable as it was before to the modern mind. But it's our classic example of what one does when one sifts through sediment to find value. So that's the physical interpretation of mining for gold. You're walking around on the earth, or Mars, or wherever that has a permeable physical surface, and you dig, and you sift through layers. There's a lot of fluffy nonsense in there. There's dirt, there's worms, there's fool's gold. There's tree roots. There's useless metals, at least so far as you're concerned. There's hard pan. There are a lot of various elements that you're not interested in because they're not gold. So you dig through all this stuff, dig, and you find some gold. And you pull it out. Show other humans it. They get happy. They want to accept it as a form of trade, and you get some value out of it. That's mining for gold in the literal sense. And if you take that parable one step further into the idea realm, the mind realm, instead of digging through Earth sediment or Mars sediment, you're digging through mental idea projection sediment. And what is this sediment layer that you're digging through here? Well, there's two, right? There's two levels there as well. There's always more than two, but I'm making it simple. There's the external stuff, layers, the internet, essentially. That's your mental sediment layer. And you get on there with your little mouse, click, click, and you mine for gold. The only difference is that this gold that you're finding on the internet is not quite as value consistent with regards to the rest of the population. So it becomes a personal mining, and you mine it. It's mine. And once you find gold, or you find something in there that's valuable to you, it becomes your gold, or your GOALED. And that happens perhaps more subconsciously than consciously. The gold part, the future projection mechanism, which provides ample material, mental material, for future mining, which is gold, GOALED. So you're mining for value and you're mining for goals. You're mine. You're personalizing and possessing it's mine, this value that you've created for yourself. And the search through the sediment is glued together. What tangled webs we weave, right? It's glued together with what? With this story that Yolanda's talking about. You have all of this stuff, sediments. The mind doesn't immediately make sense of it. It doesn't immediately collapse the quanta into a picture. That takes a bit of time. but it does inevitably collapse the quanta into a story. And the mind is very happy because now that story is mine. And now I have gold or value, which translates into future projection or goals for more mining, more possession, more scurry rat race stuff. And the typical rat race is the literal form version of the mental rat race, which really is the supporting structure that gets the physical body to run around and mine for gold in form of numbers. The computer monster wants numbers, right? That's the literal, so to speak, support structure for the scurrying of the mind. The mind is really the slave driver that gets the body to do these antics. Because without the mind, the body wouldn't know how to do that. The body just says, I'm hungry, need food. Or it says, I'm full, need to poop. Or it says, I'm lonely, I need love. And then it relies on this intricate image creator, story assembler, which we call our mind. And they come together and they make all this stuff, floating quantum bits of ether, coalesce or coagulate into solidity, into non-chaos. Because mind doesn't like chaos, because it can't make the chaos mine, because it doesn't stay put. It does this, it flies all over, it disappears, it winks in and out of existence. There's no story. It's just random sensory assaults with small amounts of cohesion here and there. Maybe some pain. Maybe some fear mixed in. And this mechanism, this mining mechanism, mining for goals, mind is always mining for goals, pining for goals, whining for goals, whining for wine, so it can forget about all the goals it made that it knows it can't attain. And the Russell Crowe situation in A Beautiful Mind, his special mining mechanism was just different than everybody else's. He took possession of a storyline that the others weren't witnessing. This also ties into Teal Swan. One of her videos that it became brought to my attention somehow in my layers of sediment. And she was talking about how parallel realities are created through emotional isolation, particularly when children with this vibrant, just open and vulnerable mind state, when they have a hurt or a suffering that goes unacknowledged by parents, by family members, or it gets pushed aside or disregarded, or it gets ignored, or it gets discouraged, punished, the emotion that rises up as some sort of suffering doesn't get acknowledged, observed, and released as it ought to, and it gets suppressed. And what Teal is saying is that now this little girl or little boy who is experiencing some suffering based on whatever, happens to everybody, now makes a split, a personal parallel reality that is separate from what she calls the mundane, or the Thanksgiving dinner, where all of the people put on a smiley face and they talk about utter bullshit because it's comfortable. They talk about the same three things because they're comfy and soft and fluffy. And they don't have to acknowledge pain. They don't have to acknowledge suffering. They don't have to acknowledge the state of affairs. They don't have to acknowledge slavery. They don't have to acknowledge brute force and manipulation. They don't have to acknowledge anything. But that doesn't make this parallel reality that the sufferer is experiencing in isolation, that doesn't get acknowledged, and therefore it's not part of the mundane or non-mundane, whatever it is, family reality. So the split has happened. And this is what's called cognitive dissonance. This is how the alters are created. ALTER. In MK Ultra, MyLabs, when psychological brain rape through trauma and drugs is used to create multiple personalities, which are used as tools, but must have handlers. And the spirit soul essence that is essentially the base conscious experiencer of all of these alters, that one can't actually be controlled. The alters can be controlled, but at some point the continuity of the experiencer will have a look. It will have a bit of knowing, and that one will say, it will gather all the alters together and say, hey guys, maybe there's a room of 10 people inside the one body, and this one singular, continuous knower, seer of the various personalities will gather them all together in the room, and it will say, hey, do we really need to be taking orders from handlers? Is that necessary? And depending on the level of fear present in the alters or the personalities, they will either have some sort of a unanimous agreement that we're going to break from this authority and we're going to manage our self and attain freedom, or you won't get a majority vote. And they'll say, no, this false authority will kill the body, or it will pit us against each other within the body and cause internal discord, disharmony. And this relates directly back to what has happened in Flat Earth, what Jake Gibson does so well, which is find a ball head, give the flat perspective, intelligent mental opposition, and have them have a fight. They duke it out. And this effectively disarms what could have been, what is for some, a tool for remembering who and what we are here in the realm, here on the planet, here on the sphere, here on the oblate spheroid, here on the infinite flat plane, here on the two-dimensional, infinitely thin data stream, which is collapsed into physical reality as perceived by the individual by the mind. It takes that possibility and it pits the internal elements or alters against one another, so they fight and they squabble and they get invested in drama and they get invested in feelings and they hurt feelings and they hurt other people's feelings. And inevitably, things escalate toward force or violence. And death threats happen. And then what happens? Poof! An element disappears. An element or a person removes themselves from the scene, and all that's left are the resilient ones who now know, who have learned that, well, if I get invested in this infighting, either I'm going to drop out, or they're going to drop out, or I'm going to be resilient. His story, her story. It's definitely not her story. That's why it's called history. Because it's left brain, macho man. It's kind of funny. The possession aspect of it comes from the feminine. That doesn't come from the masculine. That comes from the feminine. So it's a distortion which is carried by, which is apparently carried by the men who really and truly are not about possession. The men aren't. And the women who aren't investing themselves in that, the women who have their needs cared for, don't have to be in the possessive attitude either. That comes from lack. Artificially created scarcity, which is what we have here. In an infinite existence, universe, pleroma, the all in the all, God, infinite power, infinite love, infinite wisdom, we've scuttled off into a remote, dark area of that, just a little tiny thing, which is called the one verse, the universe, or this place. We scurried off into that and scrunched down. Don't hurt me. That's what we do. Don't hurt me. Because what's the predominant theme here? Force, right? Force is the predominant theme in the realm. Because if force was not the predominant theme in the realm, the guys running around with their royal colors flashing, their red and their blue, which is purple, which is royal, which is the crown, which is the archontic influence, those guys wouldn't be running around with guns and batons and papers that bind minds to prison sentences that serve nothing. The people languishing in boxes within boxes within boxes are serving nothing other than to enforce force, to legitimize brute force, violence. Force is the lowest form of coercion. Love is the highest force of coercion. Here, people don't want to do all these things. It doesn't fulfill them. They don't feel loved. So they must be forced. Because the control structures and mechanisms here lack love. If you love somebody, and in your heart you need something from them, do you go over to their house with a sledgehammer and threaten to bust open their skull if they don't give it to you? Is that your normal practice? Or do you go over there and say, hey, I need this thing. Can you help me? And you give them a smile and a hug. And they'll drop everything. Provided that they can. Provided that the force mechanisms aren't forcing them to do something else. They'll drop everything. And care for who they love. With no money exchange. Force is the lowest possible. And I mean physical force. Which is the bottom level manifestation of mental force. Or psychological force. Fear of suffering, fear of pain. It's akin to rape. It's the same thing. It's a subjugation of the physical form in order to ensure spiritual enslavement. Because really, the real force that's being applied is to your mental, not your physical. The mental is the higher. The mental is the overseer, and then the observer is behind that. Mining for gold. That's what we're doing here. The gold is in the form of numbers, which fly into a magical bank account, which isolates us from our families. And we have a big amount of cognitive dissonance going on here in the realm. And it's multi-layered. It's within us, and it's within the collective, and they reinforce each other. In force, they reinforce each other through force. It's fear mechanism. You don't do this, I withhold something. You don't do this, I smack you over the head. You don't do this, I lock you in a cage. You don't do this, I withdraw privileges. Nothing to do with love whatsoever. It's an impotent being that can't get what he wants. Someone wants sex. Woman says no. Person really wants sex. Woman says no. Well, guess I'm just gonna have to take it then. Rape. Just gonna have to take it. Force. You don't belong there. You must move. This here spot is reserved for more privileged ones. You don't have a correct placard. Could I see your identification? Move, please. Move your body somewhere else where you're allowed to be. Because you're not allowed here. No loitering. No skateboarding on the sidewalk. Where's your passport? What's your number? What's your birth date? And the spirit, the soul, sits there and cries because it's being unacknowledged. It's the only thing that's important. It's the only thing that's real. But it's disregarded in favor of numbers.